Perfect. Well, hi everyone. My name is Andy Conlin, and I'm the Outreach and Education Specialist for Colorado State University's COMET-Farm team. This is an introduction presentation for carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions related to agriculture, and an introduction to tools for conservation planning and greenhouse gas mitigation in agriculture, specifically the COMET-Farm and COMET-Planner tools. COMET-Farm is a bit more complicated than COMET-Planner, so we'll spend most of our time on that. We also want to extend a special thanks to the NRCS and USDA Climate Change Office for their continued support in funding and development of the COMET tools. I do also want to preface the presentation just by saying that I myself am not a soil agronomist, so if there are any questions that I'm unable to answer, I'll jot them down and ask some of the experts on the team and get back to you. I will be keeping an eye on the chat if there are questions throughout the presentation, but I should also have at least a couple minutes at the end for questions. So keep that in mind. So let's start with just a brief history of the tools. The USDA Climate Change Office and NRCS took things beyond the 2006 IPCC methods and developed the Blue Book, or the methods document that you'll see in a few slides. And the Blue Book document defines the equations, methods, and models to quantify the agricultural emissions related to conservation methods within agriculture. So the COMET tools were created in parallel with and as a function of that document. Since COMET-Farm launched in 2015, we've seen over 6,000 users of COMET-Farm and over 53,000 sessions of COMET-Planner since its nexus in 2017. Because users can't create an account in COMET-Planner, we are just measuring the number of sessions rather than users. But we do know that the users vary from farmers and ranchers to planners, higher ed groups, businesses, and I'll show you just a few that we can mention. Some of these users are featured in our COMET quarterly newsletter when they've offered to share how they're using the tool. Some examples include Shelburne Farms in Vermont, American Farmland Trust, Carbon Cycle Institute, just to name a few. These newsletters also tend to feature things like tips and tricks on how to use the tool, major updates from the COMET-Farm team, and stuff like that. So I'll show you exactly where you can access the newsletters on our COMET homepage. As a nexus for greenhouse gas mitigation in agriculture, COMET is used by various federal and state level programs, as well as has been used in the past by private carbon markets such as NORI. However, a note on carbon markets, COMET itself is entirely independent of the carbon markets and does not advise on credits nor answer questions in regards to carbon credits, and that's because COMET is solely an estimation tool. The methods that are defined in the USDA's Blue Book and therefore in COMET are not intended as an accounting framework for emission and reduction crediting or trading. So any questions regarding carbon credits should be pointed in the direction of the carbon markets. In terms of federal level programs, we are and will be seeing an uptick in users who plan to use the COMET tools for their partnerships for climate smart commodities. And if that's applicable to anyone on this call, I'll be including a link to a survey in my follow-up email, and that is just intended to help the COMET-Farm team support the influx of new users. Both the COMET-Farm and COMET-Planner tools are web-based greenhouse gas inventory tools for land-based systems, and they're designed for conservation scenario analysis. So there's a before or a baseline period, and then a change in management to compare to. You can access the tools directly through the URLs that you see on this slide, but I'll also show you how to navigate to COMET-Planner from COMET-Farm. In 2017, the COMET-Planner tool was created as a simpler tool for regional assessments so that users can visualize general benefits at the regional scale, and that's broken down by county. And we'll dive deeper into the differences between these two tools throughout the presentation. But first, let's look at what the COMET tools are actually assessing. Soil-related emissions are calculated through the DECENT model, which I'll talk about in more detail in a few slides. But it's worth noting that in September of 2022, we switched from the 20 centimeter to the 30 centimeter DECENT model to align with the national inventory. So we're looking at the top 30 centimeters of soil. In this example, we can see that a conversion from intensive to no-till on 60 acres of a corn-soy rotation in central Iowa equates to an estimated reduction of about 22 metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. And that equates to removing the emissions from around 5 passenger vehicles for a whole year. The COMET tool is designed to do an entire greenhouse gas inventory within an entity. And so that's however you might define that entity, as a farm gate or however you've defined your fields. We are not looking at any upstream or downstream emissions, so no manufacturing or transportation emissions are going to be included. And we're only focused on the 3 main greenhouse gases associated with agriculture, those being carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. This infographic that you see on this slide was created by a colleague of mine, Amy Swan, as an introduction into the 2007 IPCC assessment. And within the diagram, you can see various sources releasing and sinks taking in each of these gases, and each arrow is going to correspond to the outputs on the COMET-Farm report. As mentioned before, the COMET-Farm tool is a modeling platform that implements USDA peer-reviewed methods and models. So the COMET tools were developed in parallel with and as a function of the Blue Book document, which you can see on this slide. It implements a set of computer models that simulate all the greenhouse gas emissions that have been emitted within a defined entity. So that's from manure to fertilizer applications, burning, and any other management practices. Soil-related emissions are estimated through the DACENT model, and again, that's the 30-centimeter DACENT model. And accounting for animal agriculture is also available, and different livestock have different empirical models associated with them, and the same can be said for both forestry and agroforestry as well. Lastly, COMET also has an energy tool to estimate fuel-related emission reductions, but these are not going to be linked to your account nor any of the projects that are in your account. So if you do want to include any fuel-related emissions, you can use COMET Energy in conjunction with COMET-Farm. And again, that's because the COMET tools are not life cycle analysis tools, so they don't estimate any upstream or downstream emission reductions associated with the management included in your project. So again, transportation costs, manufacturing, fuel-related emissions are all not going to be accounted for in COMET-Farm, but you can use COMET Energy in addition to address those. Again, all of these methods are defined in the USDA's quantifying greenhouse gas fluxes in agriculture and forestry. That document is available to the public on the USDA website and is also available on COMET-Farm. And so I'll make sure I show you that when we jump into the tool. But to break it down even simpler, the tools are built around conservation scenario analysis. So COMET-Farm gives the user the ability to input farm or field-specific historical management practices and baseline data. So that baseline means what you would like to compare any new practices to, and superimposes potential conservation practices defined by the user as quote-unquote scenarios. And those are things like adjusting your fertilizer, your tillage, your crop rotation, anything like that. And that's to compare the benefits relative to the baseline or your business as usual. In COMET-Planner, you're still adding some kind of change in management, but you're selecting from a list of NRCS standards to compare to a fixed baseline, so you can't necessarily establish your own baseline. So rather, you're selecting from a set of baselines. In COMET-Farm, you can compare emissions, looking at what the emissions would be if you continued with your current management versus continuing with your scenario management, whereas COMET-Planner is just a planning tool. So as the name suggests, it pulls regional averages to get a broad description of the practice benefit from adding a certain conservation practice or practices. While the tools were designed around this conservation scenario analysis, the new version of the tool that was launched just in September no longer requires users to enter a scenario along with your baseline. This allows users to assess their current management without comparing it to a change in management. So that's just worth noting. So to compare the tools, because users can enter a flexible baseline with the exact management, at least within the limits of COMET-Farm, users can get a generated or a detailed farm-to-field specific conservation scenario analysis. On the other hand, COMET-Planner provides regional average estimates tied to conservation practice adoptions based on a fixed baseline, and I'll show you how that's generated in a few slides. Due to the amount of details that users need to provide, COMET-Farm does require more time investment for entering details, and then depending on the size of the project, it can take a couple minutes for your report to generate. COMET-Planner, on the other hand, only takes about 4 or 5 clicks and generates on-the-fly results when users select a conservation scenario and enter the acreage that it's being applied to, and I'll demonstrate that in a few slides as well. You can download your report on both tools. However, you can only save a project and return to it later in COMET-Farm when you've created an account. Lastly, you can access the COMET-Farm Cropland accounting activity and only the Cropland accounting activity via an API. And that would be useful if you were looking to assess thousands of acres of land, which would be tedious on the interface that you'll see in a moment. However, I will say while we have some guiding documentation on how to access the COMET-Farm through the API, we don't host any formal trainings like this one. So anyone interested in engaging with the API should be familiar with APIs and how to use them. COMET-Planner doesn't have an API, but rather the entire COMET-Planner data set is available for download, and you just have to answer a few questions on how you intend to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and provide kind of a bird's eye view of COMET-Farm before we go into Planner. And just note that the users are only going to see that top half of the slide under where it says user interface. So in COMET-Farm, users are going to provide information about specific management practices in their location. And this information is used in combination with historical practices, so prior to 1980. Along with the PRISM climate data set and the Sorgo soil data. This, combined with a number of USDA methods and equations from the Blue Book that I mentioned previously, drive the DACENT model. This generates outputs which are returned to the user as both tabular and graphical reports, and we'll make sure we touch on that during our demo as well. Oops, I think I skipped slides, sorry. Let me go back 1 second. Okay, there we go. That's where we are. Users can also, like I said, access the COMET-Farm Cropland accounting activity through the API. And again, that's designed for large-scale analysis. API users do need to create a common account. However, none of your model runs are going to be saved to that account. Instead, the API runs on the Google Cloud. So after the 50 free model runs per day per user, we would need to start charging a small fee to run more per day. Again, we have a GitLab repository with guiding documentation for API access, but we don't host formal trainings. But we do have a support desk where people can ask questions and a software developer can get back to you. The API requires XML input files, and there are examples of that in the GitLab. Each line in the XML file will match the inputs on the user interface, so it's important to understand the workings of the interface prior to engaging with the API. Once a file is run, your outputs are going to generate also in an XML output file, where again the lines are going to match the outputs on the interface. API users are not going to get a tabular or graphical report. So again, just kind of an overarching comparison. The API and the interface use the same methods and models defined in the Blue Book and in DACENT, but the API requires that XML input file and will generate an XML output file. So again, the API is really designed for rapid bulk processing. So if people are looking to assess high acres of land. Now let's pivot and take a look at COMET-Planner. As mentioned at the beginning, the idea behind COMET-Planner was to create a tool that was simpler, easier to use, and could demonstrate the relative benefits of NRCS conservation practices within a given region against the baseline data. So you just need to know your location, the conservation practice you would like to assess, and how many acres that will be applied to. Users aren't going to see the following two slides, but this is kind of what's going on behind the scenes. For the COMET-Planner tool, random cropland and grassland points were identified within each of the around 230 different agricultural regions in the country, which are defined by the NRCS as Major Land Resource Areas, or MLRAs. Crop rotations for each points were constructed from the USDA NASS cropland data layer back to 2008 in every region of the country. Then additional survey data like average fertilizer rates for crops by state and average crop planting and harvest data for each state were added and thus became the baseline for the modeling analysis. On each data point, we superimpose the conservation practice or practices selected on top of the baseline and then modeled both through the COMET-Farm API. So the same methods, models, soil, and weather data is used across the two tools. But in COMET-Planner, all the user needs to do is select a state and county, select from a class of conservation practices and fixed baselines, enter the acreage they wish to apply said practice to, and on the fly, COMET-Planner will provide average regional impacts of conservation practice adoption. And COMET-Planner is able to generate scenario estimates for 34 NRCS conservation practice standards within the contiguous US, and then limited practices in Alaska and Hawaii. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and pivot over to our demo. If there are any questions just about that initial presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat. So right now I am on the COMET-Farm homepage. A quick note, we just put up this splash page today, this morning, notifying users that on Friday, COMET-Farm is going to be down for about 2 hours for some scheduled maintenance. So we just wanted to make sure users were aware of that. So a couple of things first before I hop over to COMET-Planner, is I do just want to go over a few things on COMET-Farm. The user guide is this first tab, and that's what we call either a user guide or a manual. And this is a new development with the launch of the new tool in September. Essentially, this is an entire document that pretty much answers any question that users could possibly have about how to create a project, step-by-steps on how to create a project, how to interpret their reports, frequently asked questions, all that good stuff. So I highly recommend taking a peek at that if you're especially new to COMET-Farm. This methods and documentation tab includes a link to the Blue Book, which you can download here, as well as it breaks it down by chapter because each accounting activity is associated with a different chapter in the Blue Book. And then lastly, we've got a nice little which COMET tool is right for me. So this kind of breaks down whether you should be using COMET-Farm or COMET-Planner based on your location, what tools have data available, and then whether you should be using the COMET-Farm user interface or the API. Lastly, up on this resources tab, under documentation, you've again got that Blue Book document, you've got the COMET-Tools user guide. Our training videos currently are a bit outdated from the old interface, so those will be coming soon, but we still have frequently asked questions, a help desk, our training calendar, where you can register not only for trainings like this one, but we also host weekly office hours, which are intended for kind of detailed project-specific questions. So for example, if you're experiencing some sort of blocker that's not letting you proceed, you can hop on office hours and even share your screen, and I can help kind of guide you through what's going on there. And then lastly, I mentioned our COMET quarterly newsletter. That's where you can sign up to receive that. Otherwise, this resources tab also has, again, a tab for trainings, terms and conditions, all that jazz. But what I'm going to do from here is use our other tools tab to hop over to COMET-Planner. So COMET-Planner, again, is much simpler to use and should only require a few steps. The first step is theoretically to name your project. It's not required, but for users who want to, for example, download their report, I think it's recommended just so you can keep track of where your data came from. So I'm going to just call this training October 30th. And I'm presenting from Larimer County, Colorado. So that's what I'm going to select as my state and county. Once I've made that selection, I can select from the class of conservation practices. So today, our demo is about cropland accounting activities. So I am going to select from cropland management, but next week when I do the animal ag training, I'll be doing grazing. So once you make that selection, step 3 is populated with various conservation practice standards. And these are, again, the kind of overarching standard themselves. So things like residue and tillage management. And then once you click on that, you get the actual implements. So for example, the switch from intensive to no-till on irrigated cropland, the switch from reduced to no-till on irrigated cropland, all that good stuff. All you have to do to add it to your assessment is click the box next to it. And I don't think there's a limit to how many practices you can add. So if for some reason you were assessing all of these different conversions of tillage, they are going to populate the table below, which is where the assessment will occur. I like to show people that this info button next to each practice includes these little one-page summaries, which are useful in helping understand the conservation practice standard and make sure it's a good fit for what you're trying to assess. You can also remove them from the table using these little trash cans. One thing to note is that COMET-Planner, like we mentioned, is going to generate on-the-fly results just once you enter an acreage. However, we encourage users not to quote unquote stack practices whenever they can. Sometimes it's unavoidable. But what I mean by that is if I, for example, wanted to convert my field to no-till and I also wanted to add a cover crop, right now, if I said my field is 70 acres, what this means right now when I've added those in is that I have two 70-acre fields, one of which I'm applying a cover crop and another of which I'm converting to no-till. And so that's how COMET-Planner is going to read that entry. Instead, what I recommend where possible is there's this tab that says multiple conservation practices. And I'll admit that this list is not totally exhaustive in terms of what it allows users to combine. But in my example that I just used, I have converting from intensive to no-till and adding a seasonal cover crop. So now when I go and I don't remember how big I made my field, but the results are slightly different because of that stacking versus not stacking. So that's just something I like to point out. It is in our budget this year to continue expanding the number of practices available in Comet Farm, as well as just making improvements to the ones that are currently here. So for example, under cover crop, all of the cover crops come with a fertilizer reduction, and users have noticed that and have, not everyone who adds a cover crop inherently reduces their fertilizer application. So that's an example of something that we're hoping to improve within this next fiscal year. Anyway, going back down to our table here, like I said, when you start adding in your acreage, these numbers are going to automatically populate. Positive values that are shown in blue indicate a reduction in emissions. Whereas if I had gotten a value that was negative and shown in red, that would indicate an increase in emissions. So all of these values are quantified in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So in this case, we've got across our 70-acre field, the addition of these two practices has resulted in a net loss of 4 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. You're able to download your COMET-Planner results, but essentially all that does is makes a PDF of this table here. So a screenshot is doing about the same thing. What I recommend more so is scrolling down, and you can take a look at your more detailed emission reductions. So that includes things like your emission reduction coefficients, as well as your minimum and maximum total emission reductions. So that gives you kind of a peek at how those values were generated. And then lastly, linked here is our COMET-Planner report. This, similar to the user guide for COMET-Farm, is really where most of your questions are going to be answered. So before, emailing us with questions about COMET-Planner, I would recommend taking a look through this because it goes into pretty good detail about how the methods or how the calculations were accomplished and what methods are used in the tool. Lastly, because like I said, COMET-Planner is quick and easy and we're already done. This download tab up in the upper right-hand corner, I mentioned that the COMET-Planner data set is available for download. And that's this download tab. All you have to do is answer these questions, agree to the terms of use, and then it's a master document with all the data that was used to create the tool. So I highly recommend taking a look at that too. With that, I'm going to pivot over to COMET-Farm, where we're going to spend most of our time. So back on our homepage, we've got the option, of course, to just log in. If you are brand new to COMET-Farm, you'll be encouraged to register for an account. There is the option under registration to just create a demo project without registering. None of the changes that you make to the demo project are going to be saved anywhere because you have not registered to create an account. The simplest thing to do is to just create an account. It only takes, about 2 minutes, and we have pretty strict privacy and terms of use documentation. So your information is not going to be shared. I'm going to log in to my account. And once you sign in, you'll be brought to your projects page. This is also accessible using this projects tab in the upper right-hand corner. But this is every project that I've created since I created my COMET-Farm account, and that includes before the tool was revamped in September. I will say for users who had created animal ag accounts or animal ag projects in the old tool, you'll notice that those were not carried over. And that's because the methods in the animal ag accounting activity changed so drastically that old projects were just not going to fit in with the new methods. So unfortunately, those are going to have to be redone. But cropland, agroforestry, and forestry were able to be transferred over quite seamlessly. So from here, you have a couple options to either open an old project and continue working on it using this Enter Management button. This repository can be edited in terms of deleting projects, exporting projects, and then you also could always create a demo project, which is pre-populated with all the information that you need to generate a report. So that's nice for people who just want to kind of tinker around with the tool and get a feel for it without actually entering any real data. I'm going to create a project from scratch today. And when you create a new project, you'll first be asked to name it. So I'm going to, again, call this Training October 30th. You have the option to create some project notes just to help you keep track of what you're working on. And then you select the accounting activities that you're going to be including in your project. Today, I'm just doing cropland. Next week, I'll be doing animal ag. And then the week after, I'll be doing a multi-accounting project, which will include cropland, animal ag, and agroforestry. Because I selected cropland, I am then prompted to enter my baseline. And that's because the baseline is only relevant for the cropland accounting activity. And that's because the cropland accounting activity is the only one assessing soil-related emissions, and therefore it's the only one using DASIN. And DASIN is what requires this baseline. So COMET-Farm is going to ask you for a minimum 5-year baseline. And that is your kind of current management, your business as usual, assuming you'd like to assess a change in management. Again, you don't have to, but most users are doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I, acquired my land in 2012 and I'm currently still managing it. So it's going to only give you year options that meet that 5-year minimum baseline and then go up to the year prior to our current year. So you can go as far back as 2000 and as recent as 2023. And you're going to enter. We do have some guidance help documentation that pops up, but I'm going to just exit out of those to more effectively do the demo. When you are creating your fields from scratch, you'll get this where are your fields located. And usually what I do is go for a zip code. And then when you search, it's going to bring you to your location of interest. I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in on a spot of interest and walk through a couple of the ways that users can define tools. One of the most customizable is to draw a polygon, and that's nice for if your field intersects with like housing or water or non-agricultural land. It allows you to create boundaries that adhere exactly to the field. So for example, I could just click these corners around this polygon and that would create a field for me. And all I would have to do is then name it. Another popular one is to draw a rectangle. A lot of cropping fields are squares or rectangles, and so this one is nice and easy to just drag out, and that's actually what I'm going to keep as my field in this project. And I'm just going to call this field 1. I'm going to save my changes, and once I save that, it's going to populate this table to the right, which helps you keep track of how many fields you've created and the number of acres, and then you can always go back and edit the name as well. There's also the option to create a circular field by just clicking and dragging as well. You can create a parcel just by dropping a point, and essentially what it'll just ask you for the number of acres. So you can name your field, enter the number of acres, and it's going to create a circular parcel around your point. So that's mostly ideal for people who know the general location of their field, but perhaps not the specific boundaries. And then lastly, you have options such as modifying or deleting your fields. You can upload a shapefile, and then you can also export soil information. One thing to note is that currently COMET-Farm does have a cap of 50 fields, and that's related not so much to the actual number of fields, but actually to the number of soil map units that users include in their project. So when I go to map view and I click on soils, these orange lines indicate soil map units that are again being pulled from the Surgo soil database, which is linked to the Web Soil Survey. So the models and methods included in COMET-Farm are going to run on every soil map unit included in your project. So if I have a massive field that has, dozens of soil map units included, it's going to run on every single soil map unit and then be multiplied by however many scenarios I create as well. So the higher number of fields and the bigger those fields are, the longer it's going to take for a report to generate. That's why we created this 50 field cap, is because we didn't want users getting frustrated, sitting on their report page, not getting any results. So that's just one thing to note. If your report is generating really slowly, or if in general the tool is kind of dragging, the first troubleshooting guidance I would have is to make sure you're not overloading the model with too many soil map units. In my case, it looks like I only have 3 included. And I only have 1 field, so that helps. From here, I'm going to stick with just my 1 field and say finish defining them. Now we've moved on to our field management, and you can kind of follow along using this little roadmap at the top. So once a bubble is filled in blue, it means that you're done with that. When it's white or grayed out, it means that you haven't gotten there or you can't skip ahead. And then it's highlighted in blue when it's what you're kind of currently working on. Now, the first step, if I had multiple fields, I just want to specify which field I'd like to start entering management for. So of course, I only have 1. And it's going to start with historic management. This is carried over from the old tool pretty seamlessly, which is just asking for prior to 1980, how was your field managed? One of the most frequently asked questions is, what if I don't know how my field was managed? And all we can really say is just try your best. The good news is that it's a drop-down menu, so you really only have to mention which management is most representative of how your field was managed. We recommend reaching out to local resource conservation districts or I can't remember the term, local resource conservation districts to get a sense of how your field might have been managed if you're not sure. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a selection there. I'm going to say that it wasn't enrolled in the ACRP. And then it's going to ask between 1980 and the beginning of my baseline, and you'll remember that my baseline starts in 2012. So from 1980 to 2012, how was my field managed? And again, this is choosing the option that is most representative of your field. And then it's going to ask the same question, 1980 to, in my case, 2012, tillage this time. And so I'm going to say mine was intensively tilled. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just press save, and it's going to bounce me down. However, I do just want to mention that if I had multiple fields that were within the same zip code, what I would see is another button here that says copy. And that would allow me to take this historic management that I just entered and copy it to another field within the same zip code. So if I had two fields that, for example, in this little map right here, if this field were managed exactly the same prior to my baseline or prior to me taking over, I could copy this data from one to the other just to save myself a little time. But it's not required, of course. So one thing to note. When you scroll down, this is where we're getting into our baseline. This is, again, our business as usual. This is my current management. I am looking in this demo, I'm going to be converting my intensive tillage to no-till. So I'm going to create a corn-soy rotation for my baseline, and then I'm going to create a scenario that takes that corn-soy rotation and applies no tillage to it. So there are two ways to go about creating your baseline. The first is manual, and that's how I'll show you. So I like to start with my first year, but you can start in whatever year you'd like. And the first step is to just select your crop from this drop-down menu. Not every single crop in existence is included in this guidance document, and that's just because we are limited in the number of crops that are both included in the national inventory, included in the Blue Book, and have been parameterized in DASIN. So it's kind of an extensive process to get tools added to or crops added to the tool. But we do have a pretty good plethora of options here, and some have surrogates. So for example, trit is not included in the tool, but winter wheat is modeled quite similarly. So we recommend using that as a surrogate. Of course, there are crops that aren't included in the tool and also don't have a surrogate. Those are things like onions, which all I can say is that we do keep a running list of kind of wish list crops that users are always asking for. And hopefully someday, if it's requested enough, we can work with the USDA to get it added to the tool. So like I said, I'm going to do a corn-soy rotation. So I clicked on corn, and it immediately brought me to this window where I can define my baseline management. It helps you keep track of what you're working on by saying we're on field 1 and we're in the year 2012, so the first year in my baseline. These are collapsible, so I'm going to expand my planting and harvest date. And in order for management to be considered complete for a year, and in order for you to proceed in your project, the only required management is a planting date. Everything else is optional. Of course, most people do input more than just a planting date, but that's all that's required. So for my planting date, I'm going to say my corn was planted in May. And it defaults to having a harvest date, but you can remove that by using this little trash can icon. However, in my case, I did harvest my corn. And I'm going to say I harvested it at the end of October. Then the key thing I want to check here is to make sure that I check this box next to grain, fruit, seed, root, or tuber. And what that indicates is that when I'm harvesting my crop, I am removing a grain, a fruit, a seed, a root, or tuber. So this check is saying, yes, I am doing that. And that means the model is going to apply a certain dry matter removal to your crop for you. Any additional dry matter removal can be included in this box here, but I am only removing my corn and I'm not doing any other dry matter removal, so I'm going to keep it at 0. Lastly, for this window, you'll be asked for your yield. You'll see in fine print here that the yield that you as the user enter is only going to be going to impact your results if you also include a biomass burning event. And that's because Decent on the back end is going to simulate its own yield based on the crop that you select, as well as some other parameters for your location. So I can go ahead and enter a yield, but it's not going to impact my results because I'm not going to include a burning event, just so we know. Then we have the option to include tillage. And you have the option to just select your tillage from this drop-down menu. You'll notice that there are some Roman numerals next to the tillages. Those can be clarified by clicking on this little question mark. But I'm going to use the tillage intensity calculator. And this is a new feature of the tool that we're excited about, where users can select their actual implement that they used, apply it to either a pre-planting or post-harvest implement. And once they start selecting their implements, you'll see that, so for example, when I select Deep Ripper, my pre-planting tillage is going to be set to a full intensive till. And that's what I would like for my for my baseline. I am not going to include a post-harvest tillage just for the sake of time, but again, that works the exact same way. And I'm going to click populate intensity, and then it brings that value over for me. You have the option to include other field operations as well as additional tillage events that are not included here. So these are specified as pre-planting and post-harvest. If you want to include a tillage event during your growing period, which would threaten to kill your crops, you have the option to do that there. And that's also where burning events are. I'm not going to add any fertilizer for the sake of time, but this window is where you can add it. And both fertilizer and organic amendments, when you start to add them into your management, they're totaled at the top of at the top of this panel as total nitrogen applied. So that helps you just kind of add up the two types of applications and you can see the total. And then we also have the addition of biochar added to the tool this year, which is exciting. Irrigation functions about the same as it did in the old tool, where you can either enter your irrigation activities manually or you can use auto irrigating. And I think the entries here are pretty self-explanatory. And then grazing and liming, which I'm not going to include in my management today. When I press save, you'll see that this little check mark at the end of my year gets populated, and that's because management, again, is considered complete. All I needed to do really was enter a planting date in order for that to be the case. Once every year in your baseline has that green check, that's when you can proceed. You do have the option to add up to 3 crops per year. However, those crops cannot be growing at the same time because the tool just doesn't support concurrent growing periods. So you'll see that actually, if I went to add winter wheat to my year, under planting and harvest, it will tell you you already have corn growing from May to October. So your planting date will have to be outside that window. So, and it also grays out those dates. So I can't select anything during that growing period. I would have to plant my winter wheat after my corn has already been harvested. And that's an improvement of the tool. People used to get a little confused on overlapping dates. And so I think we've alleviated that problem. So the last thing I'll show you in the kind of manual option here is the option to copy your management from one year and one field to another. So for this year, 2012, let's say I want all of my management, and that's across crops too. So if I did in fact add winter wheat, it would be for both corn and winter wheat. If my management is going to stay the same across years, I'm going to use this button here that says copy years management. And in my case, every other year, I'm going to have my corn planted the same day, harvested the same day. I'm going to apply the same amount of fertilizer. I'm going to till it the same. And when I press save and copy, that is going to populate every other year in my baseline with that same management. I could then go through and do the same thing with soybean. One thing to note is I only have one field right now, so this isn't applicable, but if I had multiple fields, I could also copy my crops not only from year to year, but also from field to field, assuming that the crop grows in both locations. An exception to that is rice, for example. If I have rice included on one field that's in California, it's not going to let me copy rice to a field in Iowa because we don't have rice accounting available in that region. So that's just one thing to note. Okay, so that's how you would go about adding your management manually. We also have this button called that says crop templates. And what this is it's a list of crops that we have predefined templates for. So these templates include things like typical planting and harvest dates, fertilizer application rates, things like that. So this is ideal for users who have, for example, a general idea of what crops were growing historically in their land on their site, but they might not have, dates of fertilizer application and the amounts that were added. So in this case, all I would have to do is select corn and soybean from this list. This is just a binary yes or no, was it irrigated? And so I'll just say my corn was irrigated and my soybean wasn't for the sake of diversity. And then again, I want to say that pre-planting tillage was full intensive till. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to take the order of which I've listed my crops, and it's going to create a rotation in that order for my entire baseline. And it's going to overwrite the data that I've already entered. So it's important to know that this isn't going to apply just to a selected year or anything like that. It will overwrite existing data and it will populate your entire baseline. You can add more crops to this list. So if your years want like corn, potato, soybean, you can create that order and then have it populate your baseline as well. So I'm going to go ahead and press save. And what you'll notice is that it'll populate my baseline with corn and soybean. And you might not be able to tell, but if I go into my crop management for corn, the dates are slightly different and my yield has changed. So that's how I know that it got overwritten. So from here, I now have green checks all across every year in my baseline, so I'm good to go. There's an option to check out this button at the bottom that says review inputs. This just lets you look at every management entry, so you can double check to make sure you didn't miss anything, to make sure you didn't over fertilize, something like that. When I click next, it's going to give you the option to either go straight to your report or add a scenario. That's a new addition to the tool, is that scenarios are optional. I still think the tool is most valuable for conservation scenario analysis, so comparing your baseline to a change in management. So I am going to add a scenario. The first step from this drop-down menu is just to name your scenario. So I'm just going to call this convert to no-till. And a really big time saver is if you're only changing one or two aspects of your management, it's really helpful to just copy your management from your baseline. So in this case, I'm going to copy my baseline and then I just need to adjust my tillage and then I'm done, as opposed to having to manually re-enter all of that data. So now I'll say create new scenario. and that will automatically be selected. It has a green check because management is technically complete, even though I haven't changed anything. You still do need to select which field you're working on, but otherwise, this page functions the exact same way as the baseline page. So there's only one new button, which I'll get to in just a moment, but otherwise, you'll see that your scenario is projected 10 years into the future, so 2024 to 2033, and it maintained my baseline as I asked it to. Everything else in terms of editing your management, copying from year to year, everything functions the same, as well as the crop templates. The only thing that's new is the Conservation Practice Advisor. This is a favorite feature of mine, especially for trainings and stuff when I'm trying to kind of zip through. And that's because what it can do is it can apply a conservation practice automatically for you. So for example, if I wanted to add a cover crop, I can go ahead and just select which cover crop, and if I said save and copy, it would add a cover crop in for me. It would make sure that the planting and harvest dates are not overlapping, and it would apply kind of typical management to that cover crop. Today, like I said, I'm going to opt to convert to no tillage. So I'm going to press save and copy. And now you'll notice that even though, again, it looks the same, if I go into my corns management, which you'll recall had full intensive till, it now says no till. So that worked swimmingly. Again, I could have done that manually by going into my corn, adjusting the tillage, and then using this copy feature to copy to every other year. But for the sake of time, I wanted a shortcut. Again, you can always review your inputs to make sure you caught every instance of what you wanted to change. But I'm going to just go ahead and continue to the report. I only have one field, and I don't remember how many acres it was, but it wasn't huge. So this should only take about 2 minutes to generate. Yeah, it's already on step 2 of 6. So, but I don't want to just sit here and have you guys stare at a spiraling wheel. So what I'm going to do is scroll down to this interpret report button, because this has a screenshot of the report that I can at least begin to explain, and then we can bounce back to the report once it's generated. But this tab, actually I should do that live, hold on. This tab at the top where it says Cropland, that's because it's the only accounting activity included on in my project. If I had more, they would be separate tabs here that I can click between. Similarly, if I had more than one field, those would show up as tabs here. Yeah, so you can see they're grayed out. So the selected field is in blue, and then I could tag or tab over to field 2 to take a peek as well. By default, the report is only going to be showing you emissions from your baseline. However, in my case, I have a scenario, and so what I'll need to do is hit this yellow View Scenarios button and opt to view my Convert to No-Till scenario, and that's where I can see the comparative results. Overall, we've got our source and subsource categories going down the left-hand side of the report. And then in columns, we have the emissions and reductions. And those, similar to COMET-Planner, are designated as blue and red. However, the negative signs have changed slightly. So a negative value shown in blue indicates a reduction in emissions or an increase in sequestration, and red values indicate an increase in emissions or a decrease in sequestrations. I'm just going to hop over. Oh, it generated. So we can see this live. I'm going to click View Scenarios, Convert to No Tillage, Apply, and then it's going to add this table here. So what most folks are going to be paying attention to is actually this change column. So this column assesses when I adjusted my tillage from intensive to no-till, how did that affect my emissions? And it looks like we reduced our emissions by 4.1 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. One thing that a lot of users, I think, get confused about, so we've tried to make it as clear as possible, but it's just a little existential, so it's hard, is you'll see this range of dates under your baseline, and you're thinking, I started my baseline in 2012 and it only went up to 2023, so why is this projecting my baseline into the future? And that's because that's what the tool was designed to do. So essentially, it's taking the last 10 years of my current management, so again, that intensive tillage, and it's saying, if I continued that for another 10 years, what would my emissions look like? And that's why we see a lot of red, is because that intensive tillage is releasing a lot of that carbon. Similarly, our scenario says if I adjust my tillage to no-till, and I do that, and I've done that for the last 10 years, what would it look like if I continued to do that into the next 10 years? And that's where we see, again, we're still seeing kind of a net emission here because, it's an agricultural operation, but compared to our baseline, we're reducing our emissions because of that change in management. So that's what can get a little confusing. And again, that's broken down by our 3 main greenhouse gases. So we've got CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane, but they are all quantified in terms of metric tons of CO2 equivalent over that 10-year period that I described. You have this right now. You'll see that there's this mark next to dual, and that's because if I scroll all the way down, I have a graphical report available at the bottom. I could also just view the graph if I wanted to. I can view an assessment of my water holding capacity. I can view my emissions per acre. I could look at my uncertainty. So this report is pretty customizable, which is nice. And then at the bottom, along with that Interpret Your Cropland report, which I highly recommend if you're a first-time user referring to, especially when it comes to that 10-year period that I described, because it just kind of walks you through that. You also have the option to download your report, which essentially takes the values that were generated on your report and presents them as a Excel file, as well as you can get like a detailed Excel file, and then a PDF of your graph. So that's all kind of zipped up into a file for you. Or you can export your project, which is a .cmt file, which can be re-imported into the tool by another user. Or, for example, sometimes I have users export their project and send it to me so that I can take a peek in their project. When you click export, you have the option to either download it or have it sent to an email. Okay, I am going to stop recording and